The room fell silent, not the polite silence of an audience waiting for a speaker to begin, but the breathless, suffocating silence that comes when history announces itself without warning. The grand auditorium at Georgetown University Law Center Cathedral of American Jurisprudence, where future senators and Supreme Court clerks had cut their teeth on constitutional theory, had never felt so small, so intimate, so dangerous. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg sat at the center of the stage, bathed in a single spotlight that seemed to magnify both her frailty and her presence. At 86, her body had become a kind of paradox, fragile as parchment, yet immovable as marble. The lace collar she wore, the one that had become a symbol of dissent, of quiet rebellion, rose and fell with each measured breath. Her hands, thin and spotted with age, rested on a leather folder. Inside were notes she would never need. She had been answering these questions, in courtrooms and classrooms, for 60 years. Opposite her stood Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, 38 years old. Yale Law, civil rights attorney turned congressional lightning rod. Her presence was electric, kinetic, unapologetic. She wore a navy suit, tailored sharp, and her voice, when she spoke, cut through air like a blade through silk. She represented something new in American politics: impatience weaponized into policy, frustration transformed into force. Where Ginsburg had built her legacy brick by careful brick, Crockett wanted to detonate the foundation and start over. The Georgetown Law Symposium on Women and the Constitution had been planned as a celebration, a retrospective, a victory lap for one of the most consequential legal minds in American history. But Crockett had other plans. Justice Ginsburg, she began, her voice steady, almost surgical in its precision. With all due respect for your legacy, and I mean that sincerely, have to say it, your cautious approach to women's rights has failed us. The audience inhaled collectively. Phones appeared in hands like fireflies at dusk. While you chose to work within the system, Crockett continued, her eyes never leaving Ginsburg's, generations of women continued to suffer. Your incrementalism, however well-intentioned, became a shield for those who wanted to delay justice indefinitely. And your celebrated friendship with Justice Scalia, a man who voted against women, against LGBTQ rights, against voting access, that friendship legitimized his harm. It normalized it. She lifted a document, held it like evidence. These weren't academic disagreements. They were real harms to real people. Yet you called him your best friend. You shared opera boxes and New Year's dinners while his votes dismantled protections you claimed to care about. So, I have to ask, when does compromise with those who undermine our rights stop being strategy and start being surrender? The words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Students whispered, professors stiffened. The moderator, tenured constitutional scholar who had clerked for Ginsburg in the 90s, looked as though he just watched someone set fire to the Mona Lisa. And Justice Ginsburg did not move. She sat perfectly still, her expression unreadable, her gaze locked on Crockett with the calm of someone who had faced down far worse than anger. She had been insulted by senators, dismissed by judges, condescended to by colleagues who thought a woman had no place in a courtroom. A young congresswoman's fury was nothing new. What was new, what made this moment different, was that Crockett wasn't wrong. To understand why that Georgetown stage felt like a courtroom, you have to understand who Ruth Bader Ginsburg was before she became notorious. In 1970, when she co-founded the Women's Rights Project at the ACLU, the law was not just biased against women. It was openly, proudly hostile. Women could be denied credit cards without a husband's signature. Pregnant teachers were fired on sight. Marital rape wasn't a crime in most states. Universities imposed quotas to keep female enrollment artificially low. And the Supreme Court, 9 men, no exceptions, saw nothing wrong with any of it. Ginsburg's strategy was surgical. She didn't demand revolution. She demanded coherence. She chose plaintiffs carefully. Sally Reed, a mother, denied control of her son's estate. Stephen Wiesenfeld, a widower, denied survivor benefits because he was male. Sharon Frontiero, an Air Force officer whose husband was denied spousal benefits. Case by case, brick by brick, she dismantled the architecture of gender discrimination not with slogans, but with logic. She made the court confront its own contradictions until the only intellectually honest position was equality. By the time she was appointed to the Supreme Court in 1993, she had won 5 of 6 cases she argued before that same court. She had rewritten the legal definition of gender. She had done it without marching, without shouting, without burning anything down. She had won by making injustice look illogical, and for that, an entire generation worshipped her. But another generation, Crockett's generation, looked at Ginsburg's methods and saw something else: permission to wait, an excuse to move slowly, a legal philosophy that valued process over people. Jasmine Crockett had grown up watching the system fail. She was born the year Ginsburg joined the D.C. Circuit. She came of age during the Iraq War, the financial crisis, the rise of mass incarceration, the gutting of voting rights. She watched Trayvon Martin die, watched Eric Garner beg for breath, watched the Supreme Court get the Voting Rights Act. Ginsburg's dissent be damned while Justice Scalia smirked from the bench. To Crockett, Ginsburg's incrementalism wasn't just slow, it was complicit. She saw a woman who had fought brilliantly for change but refused to fight dirty, who had sacrificed her body to stay on the court, clinging to her seat through cancer and broken ribs, believing that endurance alone was enough only to die months before an election, handing her seat to a conservative who would spend decades dismantling everything Ginsburg had built. Crockett didn't hate Ginsburg. She mourned her, because Ginsburg represented a kind of faith in institutions, in civility, in the idea that reason could defeat unreason that Crockett's generation no longer had the luxury of believing in. The moderator tried to intervene. "Congresswoman, perhaps we could refocus on, this is the focus," Crockett interrupted, her voice sharpened. "When we treat people who deny our equality as friends instead of opponents, we normalize injustice. Incrementalism is a luxury for those who aren't suffering." A few students began to clap. Others hissed them quiet. The room felt like it was splitting in two. And still, Justice Ginsburg said nothing. She reached for her glasses, thin, wire-rimmed, almost invisible, and removed them slowly. Folded them, set them beside her notes. The gesture was small, deliberate, and somehow louder than anything Crockett had said. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost gentle, but it carried the weight of granite. "Debate," she said, "is the heart of democracy." The room stilled, and what we see here this very moment is a disagreement over how lasting change achieved in our constitutional system. She opened her folder, her movements unhurried, as though she had all the time in the world. "When I began my work in the 1970s, the law was not just biased. It was openly hostile to women. You could be fired for being pregnant, denied a mortgage for being single. Marital rape wasn't a crime. Universities excluded women entirely." Her voice strengthened, each word a hammer striking stone. "So I fought, case by case. Sally Reed, Frontiero, Wiesenfeld, Goldfarb, Duran. Every case was a brick in a wall that had to be rebuilt from the ground up. You call them small steps. I call them survival strategies." She paused, looked directly at Crockett. "You say my friendship with Justice Scalia was weakness. Yet that friendship once changed language in a Supreme Court opinion. He didn't change his vote, but he listened. And in VMIV, Virginia, his questions during oral argument shaped my majority opinion. Would you call that surrender? I call it progress through persuasion." The audience was motionless. Even the cameras had stopped clicking. "My dissents," Ginsburg continued, her tone softening but not yielding, "you say they were symbolic. But dissents are not decorations. They are messages to the future. When I wrote in Shelby County that throwing away preclearance was like discarding your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not yet wet, it wasn't a slogan. It was law, and that dissent is still cited in litigation today." Her gaze never wavered. "As for retirement, none of us see the future. I believed I still served, with purpose. That is all any of us can do. Then she leaned forward, and her voice dropped to something almost intimate. But let us never frame advocacy as a false choice between polite patience and fiery defiance. Both are essential. Change requires persuaders within and protesters without. The builders and the breakers, the careful and the bold. That is how the arc bends. She closed her folder. Civility is not surrender. Strategy is not weakness. And wisdom, true wisdom, is knowing when to confront, and when to persuade, when to demand, and when to listen. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, pregnant with the weight of something that couldn't be undone. Within an hour, the exchange was everywhere. Twitter exploded. #RBG Masterclass trended alongside #Crockett Speaks Truth. Cable news played the clip on loop. Legal scholars called it the most important public dialogue on jurisprudence in a generation. Political operatives called it a disaster. Students called it a reckoning. At Harvard Law, Professor Lawrence Tribe assigned the exchange as required viewing, titling the lecture, "When Two Justice Theories Collide." At Howard, students debated whether Ginsburg had defended herself or an entire philosophy. Jeffrey Toobin wrote in The New Yorker, "She wasn't defending herself. She was defending an entire worldview. That endurance, not outrage, sustains reform." But the most surprising response came 3 days later. Congresswoman Crockett published an essay in The Atlantic titled, "What Justice Ginsburg Taught Me About Power." "Her words unsettled me," Crockett wrote, "but they also humbled me. Maybe change doesn't come from one kind of voice. Maybe it takes all of them, the cautious and the bold, the patient and the impatient. Maybe the revolution needs both the people who tear down walls and the people who know how to rebuild them." The essay went as viral as the confrontation itself. 3 years later, on the House floor, Congresswoman Crockett stood to introduce the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. In her opening remarks, she quoted Ginsburg's Shelby County dissent word for word. "Throwing away preclearance when it has worked and is continuing to work is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet." When the bill passed with rare bipartisan support, Crockett's voice broke. "Justice Ginsburg taught me," she said quietly, "that passion and patience must walk together. For those of us who have lived long enough to see cycles of protest and progress repeat, the Georgetown exchange feels like more than a viral moment. It feels like a parable. One woman demanded speed, the other demanded structure. One believed the system was broken, the other believed it could still be bent. And both, in their own way, were right. Justice Ginsburg once said that real change, enduring change, happens one step at a time. But Crockett reminded the nation that every step requires someone brave enough to take it. The truth is, progress has never belonged to one kind of warrior. It belongs to the ones who shout from the streets and the ones who draft the laws that make those shouts matter. It belongs to the impatient and the enduring, the builders and the breakers, the careful and the bold. As one scholar later reflected, democracy breathes through disagreement. The persuaders and the protesters are not opposites. They are rhythm and melody, composing the same song of justice. And so, long after that night at Georgetown faded into memory, what endures is not the clash but the dialogue. Because in that hall, 2 women, one of the past, one of the future, did more than debate. They reminded a divided nation that progress does not come from choosing sides in the fight for justice. It comes from refusing to give up on each other. If this story moved you, if it reminded you why history matters, why voices matter, why the fight for justice is never simple and never over, like, share, and subscribe. Because truth, like justice, deserves witnesses.